Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Uh, so earlier we had two sessions, two papers by two anthropologists, and just before that you had a Fanwa Faruqi as well. So I was thinking, what I, not being an anthropologist, not trained as a sociologist, what am I doing here between these anthropologists? Probably then what I will be doing is also a look at the anthropology of Islam from outside, not from inside. With that note, I have divided my presentation into three parts. In the first part, I will be analyzing some of the existing approaches to study Islam in India, while the second part, I will argue about the importance of political in understanding Islam and Muslims in India. And in the third part, uh, as a way of thinking through, or as thinking about a new opening, I will approach jurisprudence through fiqh clear. So this three section is what my paper will be largely about. So to start with, let's not talk about the pre-colonial for the time being. How Islam or Muslims has been studied uh, in India. So while titling my paper on studying Islam in India, I was a bit skeptical as well as conscious. What we have is a conference on Islamic studies. So usually Islamic is understood as an adjective or a qualifier. For example, we have Islamic banking, Islamic movements, whatever it's just like, I think it was Sayyid Mustafa Ali who said, it's like a sandwich. You add something different in between and you put this word Islamic. So it is usually understood as a qualifier or an adjective. But when we talk about Islamic studies, it is not exactly a qualifier or an adjective. If it is a qualifier or an adjective, then probably someone studying space technology, mathematics also is Islamic, but we don't consider it as Islamic studies per se. So keeping that also aside, I'm taking Islam. When I say Islam, I'm taking a very normative mainstream understanding. Okay, so we have already existing. We have different frames to understand Muslims in India, or approaches to studying Islam. Immediately after partition, there was a uh, superiority for the nationalist kind of understanding, where Muslims has been understood as a reminiscence of certain colonial practices, where you understand Muslims as a reminder and a remainder, as Professor M.T. Ansari says. Muslims always reminds the Indian nationalist as about an ugly past or a reminder of Pakistan. On the other hand, it is a reminder, uh, something that has been remind here that hasn't gone there. So in both ways, it has been understood. So more or less, Muslims has been understood as communal minorities. Always invokes this question of integration. Muslims has to give up their political loyalty to any external nation, whether it is Pakistan or their affinity towards Mecca or Medina or wherever, and they have to be loyal to India. So there is this frequent question of integration, integrating into the nation. So this is the earlier frame, especially after the so-called partition, which is also known as India's independence. Uh, then we have, especially after 1970s and 80s, uh, there is a re-emergence of social that is happening across India. Uh, there is a minor understanding about a failure of Nehruvian secularism. Secularism is not doing anything to the social, rather, it is keeping all the hierarchy and structure of the social. So, this understanding was the among not only the social scientists but among the larger Dalit movements as well. So there was a conscious re-emergence of social in the 1980s, which also led to what we call the project of subaltern studies, which you all might know. The whole project of subaltern studies, which initially started in 1980s with Ranajit Guha and similar scholars. Interestingly, uh, subaltern studies initially was critiqued as only engaging with the class position of the peasants. Then they started to engage with the caste question. Then they started engaging with the gender question and religion. And the moment they engaged with Islam, the last volume, the 12th volume that appeared in 2009 or 12, I think, then the whole subaltern studies project got ended. So immediately you engage with Islam, the question of subaltern have a different kind of turn. Oh, sorry, what happened here? In the same period, in the 1980s, we also have this whole debate, which the previous two speakers have already mentioned. The debate between Imtiaz Ahmad, Francis Robinson, and all those scholars. I just want to point just one quote from Nazreen Fazalboy, who said, "Sociology in India is Hindu sociology because caste has become so prominent that you understand all the social in India through caste." Imtiaz Ahmad also uses the same frame to understand Muslims. The exact structure, the exact frame that has been used by the upper caste sociologist to understand caste has been re-employed by Imtiaz Ahmad to look at Muslims. In other way, the sociology in India is Hindu sociology. In the same period, globally, we have something else is happening. It is assumed that secularism, modernity, etc., has led to the death of religion. Then there is a whole re-emergence of religious movements, whether it is the Iranian Revolution or the Protestant movements rising in different parts, the western parts, as well as in Africa. So there is a discourse about return of religion, as if religion was dead and it is coming back. This is also happening in 1980s. In India, how do we think about the return of religion? Usually, what happens is, in the Indian context, the return of religion has been located through the return of caste as well as the reorientation of Muslim movements during the Mandal Babari debates. What I would argue is that it is not the Muslim movements who initiated the return of religion in India, but it is the revitalization of Sangh Parivar project with Ram Janmabhoomi movement that started in 1980s. That is actually the return of religion in India. So we have to understand the Hindutva movement in that frame as well. So then we have the next epoch, which is of course the demolition of Babri Masjid. Immediately after the demolition of Babri Masjid, you have a lot of new works coming out about Muslims. Muslims has been understood in different frames. For example, one of the pioneering political scientists, Rajani Kothari, who talks about caste movements as secular movements. The same person talks about the Muslim mobilization in the post-Babari period as communal. And he says the minorities has to give away some of these demands so that the Hindu majoritarianism will not happen. So this was the larger argument. It is the minority communalism that is contributing to the majority communalism. That was the larger debate. Uh, then the most of the Muslim organizations which were formed after Babri Masjid demolition, that were understood as reactionary movements rather than having their own autonomous stand in itself. In the same period, we have some sort of debate happening, especially after Iranian Revolution and other kinds of movements in other parts of the world, which Asaf Bayat has called as post-Islamism, or Robert F. Nero called it as civil Islam, or Islamist democracy, or public Islam. In different words you have, or different terms you have. So in all this, the larger assumption is that Islamist politics has failed. In Gilroy, you will continuously have this failure of political Islam, failure of Islamism, this frequent debates about failure. And then you have a new turn is happening within Islamist movements. That's a larger argument that's happening in all these words, where the Islamist movements are shedding away their so-called fundamentalist ideology and embracing democracy, embracing new modes of mobilization, engaging in politics rather than withdrawing from politics. So all these changes have been located. In India as well, there were not much works, but some minor attempts. Then you have post 9/11, after the demolition of World Trade Center, you have this whole idea of security studies emerging in West. I will get to that question a bit more deeply in the preceding slides. Then after 2006 Achar Committee report, there was some minor studies attempting to map Muslims empirically. What is the current socio-economic status of Muslims? How it can be improved, etc. So then after Modi regime in 2014, you have a new narrative where Muslims are always considered as victims of majoritarianism, Hindutva, etc. And also with CAA, you have the question of citizenship re-emerging. So this is mostly the chronological, trying to trace these different debates in a chronological fashion. So to go to this particular question of 9/11 as so important. So in West, what was happening? Abdul Karim Wakil makes an interesting argument. He says migrants in the West were understood as South Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Africans, Egyptians, with their nationalities. But after a certain point, this different, instead of locating these different migrants with their nationalities, there is a new attempt to understand them as Muslims, Muslim migrants. So what is this new emergence of Muslim that is doing into the West? Muslims are coming. There's a book titled as Muslims Are Coming. So there is instead of having the nationalized minorities, you have an idea of religionized minorities, migrants. In this context, what's happening is also that there is a understanding that Islam in that period is having some problem. Muslims are creating some issues. They are responsible for all the extremist terrorist activities that is happening. So what can we do? You already have some migrants. So how can we make these Muslims less extremist? or how can we make them moderate? Interestingly, in 2002, the same scholar Imtiaz Ahmad, who have been engaging with this idea of uh, Liberty Islam, etc., in 1980s, conducts a conference immediately after 9/11 in 2002. And he says this conference is a response to the growth in dangerous stereotypes about the connection of Islam to violence. The intention is so good, so far so good. And it is to counterbalance negative stereotypes to find common ground of interest and values. And what they achieve is they try to bring a kind of syncretic Islam, the idea of syncretic Islam, where Islam is not violent but coexists along with other religions or traditions or groups, caste groups, etc. So you have this idea of adaptation and accommodation. Islam is being adapted. Then you have this proliferation of works. Lot of works emerging after 9/11 with the same title, whether it is Imtiaz Ahmad's work, Magnus Marsden. There is a whole emphasis on lived. There is an emphasis on practice. Interestingly, it's the same period when this whole debate of everyday Islam happens in the West. So, on a peripheral, on a look at these works from outside, immediately we don't find a problem. But when we have a closer look, this conference, which was organized by Imtiaz Ahmad and Rayfield, it was funded by Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Germany. And why they have funded this conference? So after 9/11, it is from their own website. After 9/11, the foundation launched a special program, Dialogue with Islam, considering the increasingly problematic relationship between the West and the Islamic countries. The foundation intends to promote pluralism and democracy as an effective solution to prevent intercultural conflicts and clash of civilizations. In other words, there is a conscious attempt from the West, from the Europe, to make sure that Islam will be somehow compatible with democracy, or Islam undergoes a process of democratization, so that there will be less problem. In the same period, there is another report by the think tank RAND Corporation. It says, among the policy recommendations, I'm quoting from Cheryl 3, among other policy recommendations, this document states that Sufi influence over school curricula, norms, and cultural life should be strongly encouraged in countries that have a Sufi tradition. And in the 2009 report, you can actually see what it says. Strengthen and support Barelvi institutions in Pakistan while also constructing a new Sufi university in different parts of the country. And also there are attempts to bolster moderate religious leaders, etc. So now you see what is the relation between the larger geopolitics and the academia. What actually is happening? All these works may be happening out of pure intention. Even Imtiaz Ahmad's intention is so pure. But it do have other ramifications as well. Or there is a parallel project by the empire, by the Europe or West, to engage with Islam in a different way, so that they want to project a certain kind of Islam. So against a fundamentalist Islam, there's an attempt to project a Sufi Islam which is more peaceful. Then you have this whole division, which we have already engaged with. I'm not going to the details. The South Asian Islam has been understood as Liberty Islam, which is peaceful, while the Arabian Islam is Salafi, is bit fundamentalistic, etc. This whole division we have in this most of these works. This can be understood very minutely with just one work. Akil Bilgrami, when he writes an article in 1992, What is a Muslim? Fundamental Commitment and Cultural Identity, he talks about moderate Muslims and the difficulty of moderate Muslims to distance themselves from fundamentalist Muslims. This is in 1992. He republishes the same work in 2014 as a book chapter. Then in the 2014 paper, which is the same paper actually, he consciously uses a different term. Instead of moderate Muslim, he uses the term ordinary Muslim. So it is the difficulty of ordinary Muslims to distance themselves from the fundamentalist Muslims. So you're getting how the 9/11 actually plays a crucial role in the production of whatever we call as ordinary, lived, everyday, whatever, which was very explicit in Akil Bilgrami. So what's actually happening here? All these works try to say that some people are using Islam politically for their own motivations. Then actually this whole project itself is political. This project which accuses the usage of Islam as political itself is political. Or in other ways, the attempt to say that there are non-political ways of peaceful coexistence itself is political. So then we can think about which political is better or worse. That is a different debate. As Nadia Fadil and Fernando says, these attempts to counter stereotypical representation of Islam can end up producing certain Muslims as aberrational, unnatural, and even inhuman. So in these debates, what's actually happening is there's an attempt to say that the South Asian Islam, which is lived Islam, is local. It is not universal. But the Arabian Islam is universal. Then how do you argue that this is local? Then immediately there goes to say that all this syncretic Islam is happening in some locations, which is the Sufi shrines. I will just read something. Yeah. So the intention of proponents of lived Islam, as Ahmad and Raifil propose, is to dispel the misconceptions about Muslims and to counterbalance negative stereotypes. However, it do have the problem which Nadia Fadil and Fernando mentioned, which I already reiterated. So in this verse, those who try to follow the Islamic law as interpreted by different jurisprudential texts are viewed as detrimental to the peaceful coexistence of different communities, specifically Hindu and Muslim in the Indian context. For instance, if Imtiaz Ahmad unequivocally states that, I quote, an adherence to the rigidly formulated faith is not an empirical reality. He says, adherence to text is not an empirical reality. It's somehow you are saying, but it's not happening in real life. Such a hasty rejection is not only unsubstantiated, but invariably assumes that faith is indeed a problem if strictly adhered to. If you follow Sharia, there is a problem. Imtiaz Ahmad repeatedly uses the term fundamentalist. At least 3 times he uses the term to refer to adherence to Sharia. In other words, Imtiaz Ahmad says indirectly, Sharia is the problem. The framework of lived Islam characterizes Islam in South Asia as rich with variety of expressions and thus analyzes multiplicity of cultural meanings. So different works talks about that. This invariably assumes that Islam in Indian subcontinent is uh, multiple, various, etc. But Islam in Arabia is singular and one. That is also unsubstantiated. Islam in Arabia is also different. There are different traditions or different jurisprudential debate happening within Islam in Arabia. So in all these ways, there is a huge problem. Then the problem is also about a Oriental romance, which is about a peaceful and conflict between the peaceful Islam and the political Islam. The framework of lived Islam repeatedly emphasizes the local and mystic. In search of local and mystic, scholars immediately turn to the shrines and saints, making those sites the ethnographic locus. In these narratives, the mystic is local, while the political is universal. The underlying assumption is that the mystic orders are always syncretic and hence potent with local cultures. The mystical is preempted from any forms of inclination towards universal ethos or any revival and reform activities. Likewise, the mystic mode of Islamic piety is viewed as preconditioned on love, peace, while other modes of Islamic piety, which is reform or political, are viewed as prone to violence. This preference of lived Islam for a mystic Islam is as an instigator of peace and tolerance is often asserted through shrine visiting Hindus. So the Hindus are visiting shrines. So it is mutual coexistence is happening. So it's peaceful. But what's actually the problem is the search for the local, in a way, is the search for the Hinduness. It is not the proximity to any so-called neutral local that is celebrated, but the proximity to the Hinduness, thus making Hindu as authentically local and Islam as inevitably foreign. This feeds into the fundamental principle of Hindutva, which defines Hinduism as Indic and conversely Indic as Hinduism. This desire for Hinduness also arises because the imagination of Indianness is intertwined with Hinduism, effectively pushing the Muslims to the boundaries of national imagination. In other words, while all the attempts, the intention of the proponents of lived Islam is to make a better space for Muslims, what they fall into is the trap of Hindutva, where the Indianness and Hinduness become one and the same. Further, there are three issues with the framework of lived Islam that has an overriding political predicament and desire for the Sufi. First, uh, even though this says political is universal, in reality, it's the political which is actually local. The political actually engages with the state, engages with the local politics, the local issues, etc. In other words, also it can happen. The political also can be global. Similarly, the Sufi can be local and global also, especially when you think about Tariqa, you can't say that it is just local. Secondly, by claiming the mystical as peaceful and political as problematic, these analyses indirectly delegitimize the political engagements of Muslims and forestall the political existence. So most of this work have this issue where at the end what it says is political is problematic. In other words, Muslims has to be not political. In a Muslim minority context like India, any closure of political legitimacy relegates the political activism and it actually de-citizenizes the minorities. Let's try to go a bit further. So now, so far we have seen the different frames as well as the problems with the anthropological understanding which is happening through lived Islam. There are of course other modes which is within the anthropological inquiries. So what I am trying to emphasize is that we should see the importance of political while analyzing Islam and Muslims in India. Uh, the political have the capacity, the potential to unmake the community. So Muslims have been an autonomous community in the, of course, in the pre-colonial period and somehow in the colonial period. But then it's a whole different debate. But just putting it through, then the autonomy of the community has been taken away by the state, especially with the emergence of the Constituent Assembly and the Constitution, etc. Muslims has been relegated as religious minorities and thus becoming a disciplined minorities. So the very idea of emergence of citizenship is also a rejection of Muslim autonomy. It's just getting it there. In other words, minority has become a disciplined category through the power of state and the political, which erases the Muslim sovereignty. So the nation state as a political project produces minorities, produces majorities. I'm going back to Samdani, and thus it produces a disciplined minority. So the formation, the constitution of Muslim subjectivity is predetermined or co-constituted through the political. So without understanding the dynamics of political, it will be almost nearly impossible to understand Islam or Muslims, not only in India, but especially in India. So what is the power of the state or the political in this whole exercise? The state produce minorities as essential part of their construction process, since the majority also produce the others or the minorities. Minority is posited as a political category understood in construction to nationalism. And recent work by Mamdani, which is quite interesting. He says, minorities is always tolerated in exchange for their political loyalty, which in practice meant they were tolerated to the extent that they were seen by the national majority as non-threatening. This regime of tolerance solidified the structure of the nation state by defining the relation between the national majority and minority. It is this structure of tolerance that is seen as defining the liberal character of political modernity. So the moment minority has to be tolerated inside a nation state, the minorities has to declare their loyalty to the state. The moment the state feels their loyalty is not good enough, they will be seen as a threat. They will not be tolerated anymore. In other words, minorities in a nation state is not an intrinsic element within the state, but it is always tolerated. He actually says this process of creating permanent minorities by the national state is not limited to the past. It is still ongoing today. The state has used its power to define who is a citizen and who is not, in order to create a permanent majority and a permanent minority. Yeah. So I will just read two paragraphs. So what's the problem? In the framework of lived Islam, an a priori conception of religion is established that passes through the bottleneck of liberal secular order. In the Indian case, additionally, it has to pass the test of majoritarian Hindu sensibility. Thus, Muslim religiosity is regulated, controlled, and disciplined, and the boundaries of religion are managed through secular and Hindu constituents of power. So the Muslim political is always already constituted through the nation state project. In Maududi, we can see the same kind of critique he has been trying to foreground. So Maududi's propositions would help us to identify the importance of the critique of the state for the effective actualization of Islam. As Humaira Iqtidar points out, unlike any other Islamist thinkers such as Sayyid Qutb or Khomeini, Maududi lived for most of his life as a minority. But Maududi's understanding of minorities is usually read from his influential conception of Islamic State, whereby minorities are usually non-Muslims. Thus, scholars immediately focus on his idea of dhimmis, etc. However, Maududi's delicate attention to the minorities is interesting. I will just try to focus on one lecture which he has given in 1947, the Madras lecture. Delivered at a critical juncture of India's partition, he presented a four-point strategy intended at ending communal conflict, reforming the Muslim community, and producing Muslim intellectuals and engaging in regional languages. Maududi wanted to get rid of Hindu prejudices, for which he proposed abstinence from political claims. Maududi's proposal came at a time when there was a crucial lack of clarity on the safeguards for Muslim minorities against the dominant Hindu nationalism. With the partition, Muslim political claims were considered as settled for once and all, consequently stripping them of their political claims to the constitutional category of religious minorities. In the absence of a clear idea and goals and aims, the methods proposed by Maududi, like abstaining from making representational claims, which was actually a 5-year plan for Maududi, will be easily misunderstood as political quietism. This mistake has been critical, not only for scholars but also for movements like Jamaat Islami in India. Maududi's proposal has to be read from three vertices: a critique of the system, a critique of modern national state, and a critique of constitutional guarantees. So these are the three vertices from which we have to read Maududi's argument to not make any political claim or not engage in the electoral process or whatever. This is an extension of his critique of nationalism and democracy as instrumental in exerting dominant cultural and political ideas onto minorities. Maududi says that though modern democracies claim to give equal rights to minorities, in effect, it has become the rule of majority. The minorities either get eliminated or would absorb themselves beyond recognition in the majority. Equally, he was critical of the fundamental rights guaranteed by most of the modern national states, as these rights were which are available for individuals can be taken over at any point on the condition of interest of the state, which is what actually Mamdani said. It is a national interest which is always at play. The moment the nation feels it is not okay, it can take over your rights, which we are seeing, whether it is Waqf or citizenship or whatever. So the Hindutva mobilization and the state affirmation of Hindu ethos in the 1980s testifies how egregious the modern nation state can be. However, Muslim movements still recourse their arguments towards a constitutional safeguards. But what it effectively did was to expose the limitation of constitutional safeguards, the futility of the very system of nation state, and structuring of democracy and secularism on Hindu moral ethos. Muslim political was delegitimized as extremist and communalist. The issue at hand, as Genushi opined in a different context, is not to convince the Islamists to accept democracy, pluralism, and power sharing, but to convince the ruling regimes of the right of the Islamists, just like any other political groups, to form political parties, engage in political activities, and compete for power share through democratic means. It is this very hesitance of the ruling authorities, ruling regimes, to accept the legitimacy of Muslim political actors. It exposes the Hinduness of the Indian secular polity. So, more or less, what I'm trying to say is that the Muslim subjectivity in India is fundamentally formed through the nation state project, and through the legal constitutional measures. Thus, as minorities, Muslims try to behave themselves, see themselves as minorities, and directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, they try to behave in the same way. As Kavira says, he or she surely knows is a member of a minority group and how he should be behaving. Uh, let me just quickly go to the next section. So, till here, what I talked about is the importance of the political in understanding Islam and Muslims in India. It is as simple as that. Okay. Now, the second aspect which I want to put forward as an opening is the question of jurisprudence. So, why jurisprudence is important? Because it will be jurisprudence will give an opening to understand Muslims, their social life or political life in a different way, rather than seeing them as the problem with the political is that it always sees the Muslim subjectivity as passive, not able to do anything. The power is always exerted from above. But from a Foucauldian or a Butlerian perspective, the subject can also exert power outwards. In that sense, if you read jurisprudence, jurisprudence is the power that the subject exerts outwards so that the subject can move freely. So, especially the whole idea of Fiqhul Aqliya, which re-emerges in the 1980s and 1990s. Why? Because, of course, there is a larger debate happening, including in the United Nations, about the right of minority, etc. At the same time, in the West, you have this emergence of migrants as minorities, the Muslims, especially Muslims. So, the new scholarship on Fiqhul Aqliya is primarily aimed at addressing the conflict between Islam and West in the context of Muslim immigration to the West. For example, according to Zahelka, Fiqhul Aqliya is designed to allow Muslim minorities to honorably subsist and integrate into their new countries while preserving their Islamic identity. So largely their questions were always about how can there be a coexistence between Sharia and the West, and whether so these new migrants to the Western countries, whether they can work in a restaurant which serves alcohol, whether they can take mortgages, loans for interest, without which they can't be affording their lives. So these were some of the everyday concerns which initially those engaged with minority jurisprudence tried to navigate. In an attempt to seek coexistence between Sharia and the West, scholars explore different methods. Sherman Jackson, following the mode of Christianity's engagement with modern secular state in the West, proposes self-limiting Sharia instead of perceiving an all-encompassing Sharia as a necessary process to protect itself against modernity. On a different note, Khalid Abu Fadl claims that the relationship of reciprocity and self-restraint would help to avoid the polarization and thereby secure the Muslims better in the West. While such analysis is driven by an idea of liberal democracy as primarily upholding the values of accessibility, inclusion, and equal respect, it overlooks the power of state in coercing the subjects. So all this, the problem with all these studies is that they consider liberal democracy as taken for granted, in the sense it gives an inclusion, accessibility, etc. At the same time, it neglects the overarching power of the state in coercing the individuals. The ideal and neutral secular liberal order is juxtaposed with the real condition of Muslims, leaving aside the real violence and hegemony of secularism in subjugating the minorities. Thus, Jackson's Sharia self-limiting, or Abu Fadl's relations of reciprocity and restraint, or Andrew F. Marr's search for justificatory projects, all have the same problem where they take the promises of liberal democracy as real and true. But when it comes to India, uh, more than 90% of Muslim minorities live outside European and American context. They have totally different histories and socio-political circumstances. Consequently, the imminent issues are different from that of Western context. The West finds its Muslims as immigrants, students, and professionals after 1960s or 70s who left their Muslim lands to live in the West. But in the Indian case, it is totally different. Muslims in India are a conundrum in many ways. Firstly, they are minorities. Nevertheless, they are not numerically irrelevant, as they constitute a population of 200 million. Secondly, they have a history of ruling in Indian subcontinent for more than 600 years. Such a long history of tryst with Islam in India also produces different kinds of culture and heritage of Islam in the land. It makes the jurisprudential status of India in the traditional classification of Darul Harb, or the lost land. The classification resurfaced in different epochs like partition of India or the demolition of Babri Masjid. Thirdly, Muslims in India are those who chose to remain in the geography of non-Muslim majority after the partition. So, because of these different circumstances of Indian Muslims, we should try to find a new thought around Fiqhul Aqliya. So it is not simply about coexisting with other communities, because in India, as Muslims have been existing together with other communities for a long time. So the immediate question at hand were different from that of integration. In West, it is always about integration, but here the question is a bit different. Yeah. So within Fiqhul Aqliya, in general, are assumed to maintain a positive relationship with non-Muslims. In the exceptional circumstances, Ghanouchi considers entering into alliances with secular democratic groups that will ensure human rights, security, and freedom as the best option for Muslim minorities. Ghanouchi considered these qualities as Islam's fundamental responsibility to mankind. In the West, this is invoked through the narrative of possible interaction with the people of book and with those who abide by the liberal secular system. In the Indian case, we don't have such a necessity, such a new necessity. Then what's happening in the Indian case? So I'm just winding up, okay? The qualities that are repeatedly invoked for gaining the confidence of non-Muslims and to make Islam acceptable to them are generosity, kindness, mercy, affection, etc. It is entirely plausible that the prioritization of these particular characteristics as essential for dawah activities is influenced by a certain way Christianity has positioned itself in the modern world. However, in the Indian case, it is not entirely these qualities of kindness and mercy that have led to religious conversions. Rather, the unabated position of Islam as antithetical to the injustice perpetrated through the Hindu caste system. For example, the Meenakshipuram conversion. You can take it as an example. This antithetical position to caste hierarchy demands restricting the power of certain groups over others to cherish the unrestricted scope for personal achievements. So in Maududi also you can see the similar kind of example, which you can see. how he perceives a paradigm of justice. So this paradigm of justice is has to be important in thinking about fiqhul aqliya in the new context. It is not only the coexistence which has to be stressed, but there's a paradigm of justice which has to be engaged with while engaging with fiqhul aqliya. Yeah, I think I should wind up. I will skip. So far, I have critically analyzed the different frames of understanding Islam in India and pointed out the limitation in understanding the Muslim subject and the complexities associated with the local and global impacts. I have also demonstrated the necessity of understanding the jurisprudence and the political. Following these leads, instead of classifying Muslims into different registers, I propose to examine the constitution of Muslim subjects through the contours of political and jurisprudence. I would argue that the subject is itself in a site of ambivalence and condition of possibility of the subject are not exclusively constrained by the prior working of power, but also through the agency. Muslim subject in India, as a complex and liminal position, can substantially articulate these concerns. Thus, one can discern the constitutive elements and their emergences, spatial and temporal continuities and discontinuities, the rejection and avowals, the process and relationship of the Muslim subject. Last, in the wake of rising Islamophobia, discrimination, and harassment of Muslims, the recurring questions are not concerned only with solving problems within Islamic law, but to work out problems with local law as well. I mean, the laws which are being produced by the state. Then, what we may have to engage is not what Jabir Alwani talks about the fiqh of coexistence, but we may have to think about a fiqh of justice and a fiqh of conflict as well.